Have you ever thought about how would it be like to not have freedom of speech? Well, since the beginning of the American history, Americans had always had freedom of speech due to the American Revolution that overthrew England and established a free and democratic nation. Unfortunately, this situation is not equal to every country in the world, and sometimes they wish to have this type of expression. Countries like Brazil, for example, did not have a total freedom of speech, especially in the military regime. But first, what is freedom of speech? According to the First Amendment of the American Revolution, Congress shall not make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the exercise of thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of people peaceably to redress of grievances, which means is the right to speak freely and believe whatever religion and having a permission to criticize the government on whatever way the person wants to. If every country had the same history of the United States, it would be easier. However, not every country has the history and the same type of colonization as the United States. So, to have more information of how our lives would be without freedom of speech, let's take a look in Brazil. Brazil is a country in South America that is very big and has a very rich culture. However, the country had a very different history than the United States. According to Britannica, Brazil was colonized by Portugal after the Treaty of Tordesillas that determined the territory between Spain and Portugal in the Americas. The Portuguese colonizers extracted almost all the Brazil wood on one of the native woods that is very good for furniture, gold, killed and enslaved thousands of indigenous people, and planted a lot of crops of sugar cane and coffee. After this colonization that lasted 322 years, Brazil got independent from Portugal and turned into an empire that lasted 67 years, which was governed by descendants of Portuguese royalty that stayed in Brazil. After that, the Brazil became a republic very similar to the United States. On the 1950s, political tension was growing all around the world. According to Britannica, after World War II, the Soviet Union was getting bigger and conquering some countries on Eastern Europe by the Red Army, and they were starting to spread communism across the globe, influencing a lot of countries, which reflected a lot internally and externally on countries like Brazil, for example, that had always been a neutral country. Then, what was happening in Brazil during that period? It all started with Jânio Quadros' government in Brazil. According to the Brazilian National Archive, he was the first president in Brasilia, and he was elected by the UDN, the National Democratic Union of Brazil. He wasn't a very good president. His government externally was neutral. He used to talk with communist people and communist governments during that period. The Congress did not entirely support him. Because of that, he left the UDN and quit being president. There was no good thing on his government. Then João Goulart assumed Jânio Quadros' place presidency. Then 2 years later, he started proposing about reforms of basis, which the main goal of them was to reform everything, reform education, reform basically almost everything about the government. However, because he went to China and the population started to think that he was a communist. Then, in March 14 of 1964, at an election made to discuss these reforms, he said, "Our constitution needs to be reviewed. Our constitution is antiquated because legalizes this corporate economic structure already separated, robust, and inhuman." Said that the first step for the agrarian reform and other reforms that people and the government must do together. As a reaction to that, the people started rebelling, asking for a military dictatorship. Then Lincoln Gordon a diplomat from the United States, coordinated a conspiracy among business people and the military. João Goulart, because he was pressed about everything that was going on in the government in that period, he moved to Rio Grande do Sul. But because he moved to Rio Grande do Sul, the Congress established the seat of the presidency vague, asked for the help of the military just to make a temporary government, and started a military dictatorship on Brazil, putting Humberto Castelo Branco in power. One of the most important things on the military regime was the AIs, which were institutional acts, laws that exceeded the constitution and granted more power to the military. One of the most important AIs was the AI 5, which prohibited the right to vote in union in elections, prohibited any act of manifestation of political nature. People do not have liberty, and they were prohibited in frequenting certain places. The justification of the government to apply those rights was to terminate any type of communist activity in Brazil. On an interview that Caetano Veloso, one of the most famous singers in Brazil, describes in his documentary the experience of prisoners during the dictatorship. He says that people have no idea why they were arrested. The conditions of the jail were poorly. Many people stayed in solitary confinement. Their families did not know where they were. They passed through many interrogatories. Caetano did not do anything against the Constitution. He only was suspected of disrespecting the Brazilian flag by a song. The song was completely different, and the person who accused him doing that was only trying to harm him. According to Brasil Escola, as a form of protest, MPB, one of the most famous and most recognized musical genres of Brazil, which stands for Brazilian popular music, is a genre that created during the dictatorship as a form to glorify the national identity. The manifests were made in a very discreet way, using a lot of metaphors and irony to do that. During the military dictatorship, more than two politicians, 51 deputies, 2,999 people, 1,313 militaries, and approximately about 3,783 people were expelled from the government. Unfortunately, this is not all the data because even after all these years, Brazil didn't find the total number of people that had been captured, kidnapped, and etc. According to republicapublicaessa.gov, in 1968 there were a lot of rebellions in the government. Students' marches used to challenge to come back to a democratic government, stating that the regime was only supposed to last months and that they wanted to get rid of Xangu and the communists from the middle class that were supported him. The protests against censorship, the end of direct elections, some movements were allowed, such as the MIA, the Inter-Union Anti-Difficulties Movement. Many students and syndicalists started to claim that the only way of stopping the regime is to start an armed battle against the government. In Rio de Janeiro happened a rebellion of more than 100,000 people that ran away from the police, resulting in the death of 4 people. The militaries, as a sign of opposition against the rebellions that were happening in the government, to scare and intimidate the population, they put bombs and many other things. We are all certain that rebellions from across the globe had been proven that were extremely good for the government. Gilberto, a person that was in law school during the dictatorship, lived his whole life during that period, speaks his opinion about why should a person criticize the government.
Olha, eu acho que em qualquer país democrático tem que existir liberdade de expressão, né? As pessoas têm que dizer o que acham, é o pluralismo de ideias, né? De falar qual a opinião, o que acha, o que está certo, o que está errado. E o governo ele tem que estar aberto para isso, né? Para receber críticas e buscar, naturalmente, melhoras, para que a sociedade cresça, se desenvolva. Então é fundamental que haja essa liberdade, entende? Então, claro, dentro de responsabilidade, né? Você tem que ter responsabilidade no que fala. Então, sempre tem fatores e informações que às vezes não chegam até você e que na discussão, né, na troca de ideias, você passa a ter conhecimento e entender melhor o outro lado, ou o outro lado entender o teu. Não existe sociedade democrática que não tenha liberdade de expressão. Ela não tem como se desenvolver, tá?
The civil rights movement in the United States just affirms that how the population criticizing the government could change and make the country a better place. As we take, for example, the Martin Luther King speech, Emmett Till's murder movement, and many sit-ins and protests basically everywhere in the United States, they helped change and they helped make the Constitution that we have now abolished, the Jim Crow laws, the Brown versus Board of Education law that permitted the segregation into place, making it equal for everyone, not only for a specific group. And if we don't allow these types of things in government, it will not grow, it will not achieve new goals, it will just keep stuck in the past. Although it's good to criticize the government, but sometimes criticizing someone could reach a point which is not criticizing, not on the point of oppressing someone. José, an accountant from São Paulo that had already witnessed the dictatorship before the coup attempt of 1964.
Olha, o governo, em alguns casos, o governo merece crítica. Eu acho que tem que ter um respeito pelo governante. É o que não acontece isso hoje. Hoje as pessoas metem o pau aí a qualquer coisa. Não tá, eu acho que não está certo. Agora, existem críticas que realmente, o dólar hoje está a R$ 6 e pouco. Porque aí vão criticar o governo que não faz nada para melhorar isso. Essas críticas são construtivas ou são possíveis.
José Carlos, another person that lived through that period, highlights how the public safety was greater in the military dictatorship.
Antes e depois da ditadura, tem algumas coisas da época da ditadura que não é que elas eram boas, elas eram melhores para o cidadão na questão, principalmente na questão da segurança pública, né? Porque os contraventores dos bandidos naquela época eles tinham medo, né? Porque eles sumiam, faziam coisa errada, desapareciam, né? Ou seja, eram aniquilados. Tá certo isso? Não tá certo, né? Justiça não se faz dessa forma. Mas, na realidade, a população em si tinha mais essa segurança. Mas era a única coisa que eu vejo que era teoricamente melhor naquela época. Então, a maior diferença que eu vejo entre aquela época e a época depois, pós-ditadura, foi, na realidade, a maior parte é que em relação ao direito de você fazer aquilo que você quer. Em todos os sentidos, né? Sem medo de ser perseguido, né?
Another thing that the military government exceeded at was between the years of 1931 and 1979. That was the period of greatest economic growth in the country's history. According to market trends, the Brazilian death rate on 1964 to a 1985 went to 12 to 7 deaths for 100 people. According to the Agência Brasil.abc, the GBT showed an annual rate of 6.25%, and the GPT per capita increased 3.64%. According to an article made on BBC, the country developed a lot. The inflation decreased from 92% in 1964 to 15.6% in 1973. More jobs appeared, especially on the industry, from 2 million in 1965 to 3.5 million in 1985. The Rio Bridge, that is one of the most important bridges for people that lived in Rio de Janeiro nowadays. The hydroelectric plant from Itaipu, which is one of the greatest hydroelectric plants in Brazil and one of the main sources of energy. The military is invested in the development of the industrial park called Zona Franca de Manaus, Free Economic Zone of Manaus. More people moved to the cities. The life expectancy increased from 56.3 years to 63.5 years, which is a huge increase. And even though the people that lived in the cities, they were protesting and they were rebelled against the government, on the other hand, the people that lived on the countryside of Brazil had a totally different opinion. Osvaldo is the oldest person interviewed. He has an amazing experience with the dictatorship, and he showed some surprising opinions.
A gente mora numa cidade menor, onde existe batalhão do Exército e, na época, a amizade para nós civis, para os militares, foi da melhor possível. Foi uma política bem positiva que passou e deu certa credibilidade para o povo.
To sum up, Jesus started a process of political opening where the government made some concessions with the people with the point to solidify the military system and expecting the people to be loyal with them. However, it did not work very much because the population became very inspired, and due to the drop of the economy during that period, the people were on the side of the militaries and still had their reaction. On 1979, during the Figueiredo's government, he declared the law of amnesty, which was a law that forgave all the political crimes committed during the military regime until 1979. It undermined some of the AIs. After a while, after a lot of pressure from the population, during the election of Tancredo Neves and his vice president José Sarney, he put an end to the military government. Then, after everything that Brazil came through, Brazil never had any problem with freedom of speech. After the military regime, it all became like before, and the dictatorship became like a past, a very distant past that nobody wants to remember about it. As Justice Thurgood Marshall says, to suppress expression is to reject the basic human desire for recognition and affront the individual's worth and dignity.